You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast with myself, Owen Walker. In this episode, I'm speaking with Claire Park on 10-second triage. So what I wanted to do is look at this new triage tool, this primary triage tool, developed by Claire and a research team. So it's been accepted and agreed by NHS England for use by all UK ambulance services and also National Police Services and Fire and Rescue Services. It's also been adopted by the RNLHI and indeed different various mountain rescue teams across the country. If that wasn't enough, it's also been adopted by UK MOD, so the Ministry of Defence, to be rolled out across all UK military personnel. So Claire Park is a consultant in pre-hospital emergency medicine for London HEMS and anaesthesia and critical care medicine at King's College Hospital in London. She's also an army consultant with over 20 years of deployed military experience and is the medical advisor for Specialist Firearms teams to the Met Police. She's also worked closely with all the emergency services in London on developing the joint response to high threat incidents, in particular following the attacks of 2017. So she's also the Chief Investigator on a UK nationally funded research grant looking at the evidence for improving patient outcomes in hot zone in major incidents, and has developed key relationships working in this area with members of the Committee of Tactical and Emergency Casualty Care over the last 4 to 5 years. So that's quite a bio, Claire. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Owen. It's a pleasure, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Listen, it's a pleasure to have you on. Claire, can I just maybe initially get you to speak to a working definition of triage, if that's possible?
Yes, of course. So triage essentially can be used at any phase of a casualty's journey, from the point that they become unwell or injured until they leave the hospital, really, and then could even go on to sort of rehab. But particularly for this project, we've been talking about the triage definition we've been using is that of the early scene triage. So essentially a way of sorting or prioritizing casualties for that immediate treatment and prioritization for evacuation. And when I say that kind of early phase, I guess we're really focusing in on that first, essentially few to 10, 20 minutes of a multi-casualty scene, to really focus in on those important life-saving interventions at that point in time.
I suppose in retrospect, having dealt with a couple of major incidents myself, that is where salvageability is, I guess, doing the most in that short space of time. And I suppose as well, intuitively, I've always felt, maybe you have as well, that just a semblance of whatever we do have at the moment isn't necessarily working, and we'll dig into that shortly. But certainly from my experience using the SMART and START triage tool, could you maybe yourself using either the SMART or the START triage tool, could you maybe speak to what you saw within sort of rate limiting steps to these approaches?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of the reason for actually developing this is because it felt like it was originally for non-healthcare providers where we started, and we wanted something that would work for everybody, because really that first 10 minutes or first few minutes is often not healthcare professionals. But even for healthcare professionals, it feels that the practicalities of the triage tools that have commonly been used, and actually when you look, there's probably, I think on a literature review we did at the beginning of this, there's about 19 different published primary triage tools, all of which have a slightly different variation on a theme, in fact all of which require you to measure some sort of physiology. Most of them need you to remember a particular framework of physiology, so they want you to remember a range of respiratory rate, a range of heart rate, or a capillary refill time, and measure it, and then work out which category people go into. And I don't know about you, but I don't think I ever actually measure a respiratory rate. I mean, I look at a patient and I go, are they breathing fast or slow? Are they working hard or not? And to be honest, the same for the pulse rate. Is it bounding? Is it weak? Is it there? But in a super sick patient, it's really hard to feel that pulse rate. And that's in someone who does it all of the time. So when you walk into a room where there's multiple casualties and you're sort of hit by that wall of everything going on, and then you've got to focus on counting. One of the things we've seen in a lot of training scenarios and actually for real is that people they really struggle to do that counting, and it takes all of their bandwidth. And actually, if we look back at the tools that have been used, a lot of the testing has been not done actually people feeling for pulses and counting respiratory rates, but it's been done on cards that tell you what the respiratory rate and the pulse rate are. And even then, if it's given you for 10 seconds, you work out what it is in a minute and your head's gone. So in reality, how much those tools are actually used and are useful is the other thing. So probably leading on to some of your other questions, but if we look at the retrospective data analysis of them, those retrospective studies are done on first available observations, which are, I think, very rarely, if ever, the actual observation at the point where those casualties are injured, because no one's writing those down. So we're extrapolating something that isn't actually what happened.
You make a really good point here, Claire, and it's going to lead into my next question. But it's around, forcing clinicians and or otherwise to do maths quite quickly. So there's maths in a triage sieve, and then there's maths in a triage sort, and sort of the triage sort of has characteristically been extremely difficult because it's based on subjective tools as well as objective ones. So putting the GCS in with the respiratory rate, with the systolic blood pressure, but aggregating the sum total of those is actually really difficult, especially when your amygdala is firing, when your physiology is awry. But I guess so. I want to look at just the empirical literature, because you did notion towards that, and then I actually want to look at the major killers that you were after, because there's some abundantly apparent major killers that feature in this tool, but there's some real nuances here that we intuitively knew we should go after, which the 10-second triage does go after. Let's just look at the empirical literature for a second. So you said the empirical literature said there's 19 different tools in circulation. But could you maybe speak to what you found within the empirical literature?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of the literature, I think there's only actually 3 tools. Certainly, I haven't done the search in the last year or so, but when we did this search, when we started a year or so ago, we redid it. Most of the studies are based on retrospective data studies, or they're based on testing within a classroom type environment where people are given the observations and the respiratory rate and heart rate. They're not in the scenario actually measuring them. There's only 3 tools that have actually been used and recorded to have been used in reality for a real major incident. There's 13 retrospective database reviews of their use. I think there's no doubt that having a tool is better than having nothing. And that's kind of where we started with this, because the police officers were expected to prioritise casualties with no tool, no ability, because they weren't taught formal triage, which made things much worse for them. So I think I would absolutely agree with any of the literature that says having a triage tool is better than nothing. And I think that's almost what we're comparing, because we're not comparing something that could be better, we're comparing just what we had. So, and I think we're not comparing it against what actually happens. So if you look at the physiology of people, my heart rate and respiratory rate wouldn't be normal if someone who I love or who I care about has just been shot at or killed or run over or injured, or I was fearing for my own life. And I don't think that's ever recorded in that early bit. We're retrospectively looking at first observations at hospital, like the TARN database has looked at, or even first ambulance observations, but hardly anybody's going to actually record that. So I think what we're seeing is that definitely a system needs to be there, and the literature tells us that does make a difference. But the practicalities and the crew resource management aspects of maintaining your bandwidth in a situation that's high threat, of physically being able to do it and have the situational awareness to realise when something different needs to be done for the person next to you and not get stuck on one patient and move on, all of those kind of crew resource management aspects really build into it a tool that needs to be practical in real life as opposed to based on academic databases.
Claire, you mentioned a number of things in there around just looking at, interestingly, at your own physiology and indeed physiology of survivors, and indeed what they may be going through at that time, which would potentially in certain triage tools trigger priority one patient. Could you maybe speak to a couple of things? Maybe firstly, if you could speak to the major killers you were going after, and where you maybe saw the greatest utility for this tool, and then maybe on the back end, sort of your own anecdotal experience within major incident, and where you maybe saw the deficits in a triage tool. But maybe on the front end, what were the major causes of mortality you really wanted to pursue?
So I think there's the two things that we know are the killers in the first, we don't know exactly the time frame, and that's one of the things that our NHR project is trying to clarify a little bit closer. But I think we know enough from the literature in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places that the things that kill people in the first 10 to 15 minutes are airway obstruction and external bleeding that can be controlled, so what was described as catastrophic bleeding. And really, if you did nothing else other than have a way of very quickly assessing a patient for the need for those two interventions and then moved on to the next patient, rather than getting stuck in a full assessment and doing everything you know how to do for one casualty, then it feels like a force multiplier to save lives, where you've got people moving on. A lot of people are taught to do CPR on someone who's in cardiac arrest, but almost you can argue that by that point, there's more things that are more beneficial than being stuck doing that. So if you can open an airway, make sure it stays open, put them in a recovery position, move on to the next person, stop the external bleeding, whether it's junctional bleeding that needs packing or a tourniquet, then doing those things quickly and moving on are the things that can't wait. They can't wait 20 minutes, because if someone's bleeding from an external catastrophic hemorrhage and you step over them and carry on with your role, if you're a firearms officer, for instance, by the time the ambulance crew come through, if that's 20, 30, 40 minutes later, it's too late. So we really wanted to focus on those two primary things that most of us who are healthcare professionals, certainly as air ambulances, are never going to be there in time to do anything about unless we happen to find ourselves in the middle of the event. And then the other bit we've brought into this is the penetrating trauma. So the bit that it feels that external hemorrhage doesn't pick up on is the non-compressible internal hemorrhage that really none of us can do anything about at the scene. We can try as air ambulances, we can give blood, we can try to do procedures, but in reality, those casualties need to be on an operating table with a surgeon as quickly as possible. So we really wanted some way of flagging those patients as a priority for evacuation, even over some of the people that have potentially got hemorrhage control already.
So you make some fantastic points there, just around looking at what triage tools would do well, which is bleeding and opening airways, but also like you said, some of the aspects about penetrating torso injuries, which historically would not, the sequelae or consequences might be beyond sort of 5, 10, 15 minutes. They know, like you said, they know they need to be expedited, but we were speaking offline around archetypally, pain increases heart rate, respiratory rate. Children compensate well. Bleeding can be masked if it's within the torso, or it can be intra-abdominal or intrathoracic. These things are not easy to measure, but the Mark 1 eyeball, that these patients are going to need to be in surgery sooner rather than later. You almost don't need the physiological parameters to tell you that.
Absolutely. And I might just jump in there, because that intuitive triage that I think we do as senior clinicians is a really important point. This tool we've developed is for everybody, but actually, I think the aim is that we now focus on that for the early response, and then really that thing that an algorithm can't replace is that blink knowledge of a senior clinician who just looks at someone and is like, they're super sick. I don't need to do anything else. I know they need to go. Or your 5-10 second primary survey tells you everything by looking at them. You wouldn't expect someone without years of clinical experience to be able to do that, but equally, an algorithm can never replace that years of experience. So I think there's the 10-second triage tool for the most people coming in as the first wave, but as soon as possible, if we can then get senior clinicians, whether that's paramedics or doctors, in to really do that intuitive look, then to almost pick out the P1 pluses, as I described them, to after that as the sort of second wave. So actually you've got that, you've picked out your P1s, you've picked out the people you're worried about, and then you get the next level of triage to look at that. So I think it's worth just making the point that we're not taking away from the importance of having that intuitive triage, but that this tool is really about that early bit when you can't have those people there and you really need a system, a framework, something that enables people to speak the same language as well. And maybe I'll come on to that when we talk about how we developed it, but it's really important for us that people have that common language and understanding. So it's almost a force multiplier of everyone working towards the same goal.
So we'll look at the design phase actually, Claire, because I think it's super interesting how you distilled and maybe, so to speak, triage the algorithm, how you distilled the algorithm. You've spoken to some of the early scene triage considerations, and I think it's something you notion towards quite rightly so is, physiological parameters aren't helpful, but also the cognitive load of having to remember a complicated algorithm. Anytime I've been faced with a surge event, or indeed a mass casualty incident, or a really difficult, challenging road traffic collision, your long-term memory is the first thing that actually doesn't function, and actually you need these motoric, ingrained, subconscious pattern recognitions to rely on, because actually what you don't get is this very considered long-term, let's consider the literature, let's consider the evidence base. It really is far much more here and now. And something you also say is, around, which we've notioned towards already, which is the CRM, so the crew resource management factors, and almost anticipating a narrowed bandwidth, anticipating that the clinicians and indeed the survivors and or people that aren't even injured are going to have a narrow bandwidth, and these are stressful environments. So almost adapting a tool, and this brings me nicely into maybe design phases that fits a high stress environment. Could you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And this was really a big focus of ours when we started, because the people we were starting with looking at this were the firearms police, specifically the counter-terrorist specialist firearms officers, who are going to be working in a very high threat environment, but need to be able to switch between looking at life-threatening situation to dealing with casualties to flipping back again. And that's certainly been a concern of the firearms policing leadership throughout, is they don't want them doing casualty care when they shouldn't be. But actually what we've proven in a lot of the testing is if you really focus on making it as straightforward and ingrained as possible, then it's not a problem, and it actually makes things easier. So as you mentioned, the motor program aspect, by developing something that fits with people's normal assessment of patients. So we're not taking away from the normal, what people would expect as potentially a CABC assessment. You're walking up and you're doing are they walking? Is there any external bleeding? Now I'm looking at whether they're talking, a quick 360-degree check, and whether they're breathing or not. And that's what a lot of police, fire and rescue, first aid teaching involves anyway. So we really wanted to not go away from that, but to focus on the things that are important. And in terms of looking at what we included, we wanted to include something that replaced the physiology. So that measurement of physiology that takes away, it's almost your Yerkes-Dodson curve of that sort of CRM flowchart, where when you really want to focus on something, if you're intubating or if you're trying to put a Reboa catheter in, then absolutely focus only on that and get rid of anything else in your head. But if you're working in a high threat environment where there's a lot of other things going on, you can't afford to do that. And you really need to maintain that ability to move on patient after patient. So having to getting rid of that counting, of that having to work out the respiratory rate, the pulse rate, what is it, add it up to a minute. How can we replace that? Well, essentially the end organ effects of that physiology is what we're looking at. So are you walking? Well, if you're walking, you've got enough blood pressure and enough oxygen to be able to walk. So, and it's obviously the quick way of getting rid of people. So that was our decision as the first kind of node point. Anyone that's walking, let them go, and they can be reviewed later. The next decision point would be, are they talking? And we actually wanted that to be are they talking normally? And one of the kind of nuances of this tool is that if you have a little bit more training time, we want it available to everyone. So the simple question is, are they talking? Sorry, I've missed the catastrophic bleeding bit. So are they walking? Have they got any obvious external bleeding, your big C? We've changed the wording on that. Maybe I'll come on to that later, to be severe rather than catastrophic hemorrhage. And then, are they talking? And the talking bit was really to nuance the, are they meditating enough? So not just simply, are they conscious, but are they conscious enough to be able to speak? The talking normally bit, if you can nuance that, is that kind of higher level function where, if you look at the two things where conscious level often drops, your bleeding patients tend to talk. They don't become unconscious straight away. They tend to have their eyes open, they stare, they say some words. And it's really that last point where they just drop their conscious level completely, where they go into arrest. So really, you want to pick those up before they're unconscious. You want to pick them up when they're still talking and still have an ability to speak to you, but just not quite normally would worry you. So if they're talking normally, they're a P2, and if they're not talking normally or not talking, they're a P1. And then the other bit, that would also work for head injuries. So if they're confused, if they're a bit agitated, if they're not talking normally, they would be flagged up as a sick patient. On the more simple version, just are they talking or not? Because that's an easy question to ask, and we want it to be easy to remember. The next bit that makes a difference is the penetrating injury that we've brought in at that point, because patients that, if they're not talking, they're a P1 anyway. But if they are talking and they're not walking, they're a P2, unless they've got penetrating injury that could be bleeding inside. So that's why that only comes in at that bit. And then we go down to, are they breathing or not? And the other important step in this is obviously opening an airway. If you've had a head injury and you've been hit over the head, you may just have impact brain apnea, and really important to open someone's airway and leave them in a recovery position, because actually that might be enough. There was a patient on Westminster Bridge who was hit by the car, who had his airway opened by an ENT surgeon walking over the bridge, and he started breathing again. So we know it can make a difference if it's done quickly. And then the final important change, I guess, is the not breathing as opposed to dead. And it was really important for us initially for non-healthcare professionals to have that not breathing. But actually, when we look at all of these incidents now, previously, it was always said, if you're not breathing, you're dead. I don't think that's acceptable to most people now. Most people, it was always the most for the most. But actually, a lot of times, certainly in the UK, the response is there's enough bystanders who know what to do. And there's, you can really multiply that initial response by having people trained in that first aid. And there's often people who can help you. So in reality, are we really saying that people are dead in a really quick sweep on that first look without really looking as to whether there's anything survivable or not? And I'm not sure most of us would be comfortable with that. Certainly the families that I've heard at inquests who've questioned things haven't been happy with that. And it does feel like, what if there isn't anyone else? What if this is it and it's our first few patients and maybe there's something we can do about this? What if it's crush injury? That we've had an instance of that, instances of that recently, and actually crush injury needs opening an airway and ventilation, and they might survive if you do it quickly enough. So it was really important for us that in that really first wave, people are allowed to focus on opening airways, catastrophic hemorrhage, getting through everyone, and not taking what I think would be appropriate, which would be more than 10 seconds. You'd want to take a good few minutes to really pronounce someone dead at that stage, put them in the recovery position that they get the same treatment as people who are P1s and breathing. And then the next wave come through and really make sure whether there's anything that you can do. And actually, if there's enough resources, if you've got 10 people there and the bystanders want to do CPR, then let them do it. Obviously, we don't want people to stay in an environment that's not safe, and we'd never ask people to do that. But I think more often than not, you find increasingly people wanting to help. And, particularly if it's your friends, your daughter, Manchester Arena is a good example of a lot of people wanting to do CPR to help people they didn't even know. And it's not appropriate if it's to the detriment of saving other people, but if people are able to do it, then we should at least allow that until we get that next wave in. So that was a really kind of focus on how we worked through the tool initially, and then we had to nuance a lot of the terminology, work through the arrows, the design. That I've had a ridiculous number of conversations on what colour and what fonts and all of those sort of things. To get to the final version that we have now.
So Claire, that's fantastic. It's a real walkthrough of the design phase. And I guess what comes after design is initial testing, because what I love about the 10-second triage, not only is it easy to 10 seconds, it should be done in 10 seconds. There's 4 domains. You've got walking, you've got severe bleeding, you've got talking, and you've got breathing. So you've got walking, yes or no. Severe bleeding, yes or no. You've got talking, yes or no. And there's a segue of penetrating injury in there. And then breathing, yes or no. And then there's a few, recovery position, yes or no. But there's those 4 main domains: walking, severe bleeding, talking, and breathing. And that is fantastic, because that really notions towards something that clinicians can actually remember in the heat of the moment. But I guess my adjoining question is, what did you find in testing?
So we've tested it a number of times, and we've actually sort of developed it with the testing. So I won't go through all of the early testing, but essentially what we did do was we wanted to make sure it worked. We wanted to make sure people could learn it in a normal amount of time. So we sort of set 20-30 minute training time to make sure that we weren't spending ages training it. We wanted to make sure it was understandable. And some of the things we nuanced with the development was that penetrating injury, for instance, really defining on the tool. Now you'll see it's drawn out on the person, and it defines the neck to sort of groin, essentially including the armpits, because we found people not realizing that we meant the base of the neck or the groin as somewhere that could cause non-compressible hemorrhage. So we really wanted to define, and some people thought the back wasn't the same as the chest. So we really wanted to define that area and make sure people realize where we meant by penetrating torso trauma, because it's not really just torso. And that's where we had some of the errors in the early testing. Other things we found that worked really well in the testing was to have a team leader. So if you've got more than 2 or 3 responders, having one person standing back, really pulling people back into that. You're just doing triage, life-saving interventions, and moving on if people got stuck, trying to do a little bit more with a casualty. And also just that kind of oversight of, actually there's someone over there that's not been seen, just someone with slightly extra bandwidth to keep an overview of the scene while the rest of the team moved forward and did the life-saving interventions and tagging, and then pulled together the comms. So if it was police or fire in there first, reporting it to the forward command point, the ambulance commander. So you've really got that comms coming in early about what the response is, because then you've got a joined language. You've got the people talking about P1s, whereas before not everyone would know what a P1 was, which means a lot to an ambulance service. If you can say there's 30 P1s and 2 P2s, that's very different to 2 P1s and 30 P2s, because your response is going to be very different. So that common language is really important. So those are some of the learning things. And the other learning thing was about children. So in the teaching, we will put in that children under 2 essentially would be not talking or not walking, because we found that the children tended to be under triaged, I think purely for lack of familiarity and difficulty in diagnosing sick children, particularly those who are under 2 who don't walk and talk normally. So as with the tool, they wouldn't be normally talking and walking, they would be a P1 automatically, just to ensure we don't miss those injuries in children. And that fits with the other major incident triage tool, that's the secondary tool that's being brought in. So that those are some of the nuances we learned in the testing and training, and we very much got the feedback from people learning it and the people who were teaching it, and we watched it with accuracy and timing on body-worn video footage with facilitators to really nuance, to make sure we were getting everything recorded properly, and made sure the simulation was high-level simulation. Probably the key points in the final testing, which we ran at the end of this year, which was multi-agency, and we tested it with fire, police and ambulance from across the country, where probably the headline numbers were the timing. We tested the 10-second triage against the MIT, with the major incident triage tool, which is the new NHS tool that will be replacing the CIV essentially and coming in as a secondary tool. And we ran a simulated MTA of 37 simulated casualties. And those 37 simulated casualties had a range of methodologies. So they were injured by stab, some were stabbed, some were run over. There was a petrol bomb that went off in a car, and there was some smoke. So a really bad day, but just trying to mimic all of the different methodologies. Mostly live casualties, some amputees, some actual amputees, and some children. And it took for 10 operators to enter. There was no decision making about when to go in. It was purely about time from entering the scene to having triaged everyone and performed those life-saving interventions, and then reported numbers to the ambulance commander. And the average time for the TST runs was 6 minutes, and the average time for MIT was 20 minutes. So MIT was only performed by ambulance alone. TST was performed by police, fire and ambulance separately and then all together. So for us, the key thing was those life-saving interventions were all done, and we checked the accuracy of them within 6 minutes, which feels like a reasonable time frame to be performing those things, compared to 20 minutes, where realistically, if you're opening an airway at 20 minutes, it's too late. And the other thing we found was actually the life-saving interventions were generally performed accurately by everybody. Maybe by the end of the testing day, it became a little bit of a emergency services games because everybody was trying to do it better than everyone else. But what we did get was police, ambulance and fire all working together. There was someone, when they did it as a multi-agency team, you've got like a policeman asking the fire officer for the triage tag and asking the paramedic for the tourniquet. So you've got everybody really knowing what they're doing together and focusing on the same thing, which was brilliant. So yeah, I think we anticipated it would be quicker, and we knew it would be practically easier, but I don't think we thought it would be so much quicker. So yeah, we were pretty pleased with that.
That's fantastic. You know, what you've just notioned towards, because I'd like to look at adoption actually, because it has been adopted so widely because of its success, and actually, like you said, you know, tapping into intuition far more. But the sequence is, as you said, you know, the 10-second triage, the MIT, so the major incident triage tool, and then the enhanced care as a step up from that. But bringing in that enhanced level of care, maybe separate to the scene, so not in the hot zone, or indeed in the place itself, maybe in that casualty clearing station. But to what you were saying about that sequence, it's really, it fits really well, because everyone can do 10-second triage. The ambulance service are called upon to do the MIT, and then enhanced care can be the enhanced critical care teams if it's appropriate and when it's appropriate, and if that's enhanced care at hospital, or that's enhanced care at a casualty triage collecting station, then so be it. But that sequence is really intuitive and makes a lot of sense to me. And I suppose on the back end of that is why have you've got ubiquitous adoption, which is fantastic. Was that a struggle, or could people see the sequence as we've just spoken to?
I think it's been a bit of a challenge to get it. I mean, we actually developed it initially just in London, and then what we realized was it would be great, but actually it's much better. We developed an early version of it in London at the same time as which Phil Calburn was working on a similar, slightly different version of a tool with Avon and Somerset. And actually, I think the real strength has been bringing together the work that we did in London with Phil's work with NARU. So that kind of really across that ambulance sector, but also focusing on the police side of things. And early on, we'd got the buy-in of the police officers and the firearms training teams, who were worried that they were going to have officers doing something different, but that was outside of their scope, but actually understanding how it would enable them to save lives. So I think there's been the buy-in from the various agencies, but it's been really key to have the NARU kind of leadership in that area, but then taken on by NHS England as a task and finish group. And it was actually an NHS England task and finish group that Phil Calburn chaired that brought all of this work together. And I think probably helped by the fact that MIT was coming in as a new secondary triage tool as well. And we really wanted to bring them in together to make sure that they work together. So that's allowed us to speed up something that perhaps otherwise would have taken even longer. But part of our working through was to get a user group together. So really do some workshops with all of those people that would be end users. So not the bosses, but the operational, your paramedics, technicians, firefighters, all versions of police officers, and some military soldiers as well, to really, and we spent hours going through the wording of it, what it looked like, really how they felt it would work for them as people using it, and getting that buy-in. And everyone on that call, those calls were very much, this is brilliant. And the more people we presented it to and ran it by and trained it with, we found people just intuitively picked it up and wanting to do it. The ambulance people that worked with the police we developed it with would come down and go, this is great, I wish we could do this. And so you realize that actually we thought it was brilliant, obviously, but when you realize that everybody who uses it goes, oh yeah, actually that really makes sense. And I think probably, if I'm honest, the timing of the Manchester Arena inquiry and the fact that a lot of the things we were trying to address with it probably were encapsulated in some of the problems that happened, on that day. I use it as an example when I'm explaining, what it's like, if you, as the first, and it is often unarmed police officers and first aiders or bystanders that find themselves running into these events. It's the first person in there when you're faced with all of these things going on. Like knowing, having some framework, something just to go, where do I even start? And actually, that's been defined by lots of people who've walked into these events. Everyone that gave evidence there described that kind of overwhelming sense of like just almost being hit by something, not knowing what to do. Matthew Langlois, who was the lead doctor for the raid at the Bataclan, describes, despite that being his job, despite training with them all of the time, describes walking in his book into the Bataclan and having to take all of his strengths to overcome this kind of sense of, oh my God, what's happened, even though he trained that a million times. So really, really important that people have this framework that they can. I always like refer it back to when I started doing ALS training, and your sort of ABC, you've got something to, when you get stuck, to just go back to. And like you said, that walking, talking, breathing, not breathing thing, like if people can just remember that and have a card as well to remind them, then I think that's really taken traction, and people have seen the benefit in something practical and easy to use that everyone can use. So it's a long way of saying, I think it's by getting the buy-in of people, by bringing them in and bring them along with us and getting people to see how it works, and by everybody using it going, no, this is great, I can really see how this is going to work for me. And I think it's been a user thing more than anything else, and the people who want to use it going, we really want to do this. So I think that's how we've managed to get that buy-in from pretty much everyone. And we've obviously spent time trying to explain why and how it works.
So I understand, Claire, there's going to be a national rollout of 10-second triage. So it'll be disseminated in the ambulance services and the police services and the fire and rescue services and mountain rescue. And indeed, there's sort of an educational package as we speak almost this week going, being recorded and filmed. From your perspective, a couple more questions before we come into land. Have you got any thoughts on the write-up, the retrospective write-up of this, sort of reflecting on the educational package, maybe the reproducibility, maybe the sensitivity, the specificity of how it caters to and addresses acute injury? Have you got any plans to do a write-up?
Absolutely. I mean, the only reason we should have done it already, the only reason we haven't done it is because we've been focusing on actually just getting it in place and getting people to agree and the training plan. So there's Jamie. So I mean, the team of us that have been part of the task and finish group from NHS England, Jamie Vassallo, Dave Bull, Phil and myself and Sean Harris have worked on an initial short piece that has been submitted to be published that just explains it briefly. But in terms of publishing all the testing results, that's the next stage. So we absolutely will do that as soon as possible. And then it's been very much discussions about procurement. So the tagging ideally is going to be slap bands rather than the foldable tags, just because we want something really quick that no one has to spend time doing. Probably didn't mention, but the edge of the tags will be checkerboard, so it will define the TST from MIT or any other triage tool, so people know which one has been done. And then a lot of the discussions have been about, as I said, just put that design, the procurement. The NHS England will put out to tender for procurement for the tags, so that every service that is going to be bringing it in should at least have someone to go to purchase the tags from, which on a large scale should be cheaper than if people are all trying to do it individually, and it'll be a set template. NARU will maintain the ownership of the flow chart and the versions of it in case we change any of it. So they will produce aid memoirs and the training material for everybody to use. So part of the plan this Thursday is to film a video so that we can video people doing it, to demonstrate exactly how to do it and build that into national training resources for fire, police and ambulance and anyone else that wants to use it. The same thing will be available for everybody with a PowerPoint lesson plans, nuanced. The little points that I've tried to describe that we've learned through the training, we'll put into the lecture guides, because we really want everybody to be able to have that material to be able to train from. And the plan is for that to be available for everyone. So once we've got through that, with the plan for it to start to be trained from April 23, with a year to roll it out to April 24. After that's in place, then we'll finish the write-up.
So listen, if that wasn't enough in its entirety, Claire, I understand, we notioned towards in your bio, you've also got an NIHR grant approved for looking at what's happening in the hot zone and hot zone working in major incidents. As we sort of come into land, could you maybe just notion to that, because that is also in the background and you're also sort of working on that at the moment. Could you maybe just speak to some of the key or seminal points in that research?
Yeah, I mean, it's ended up being quite a big project, to be honest. It's a 3-year project, and we're sort of, well, 2/3 of the way through nearly, I guess. But actually, one of the things that I probably hadn't anticipated in that is that how long it takes to do this joint research. And there's 4 elements to the project where we're looking at a systematic review of the current evidence of deaths in the hot zone, essentially, or deaths at terrorist attacks and major incidents. So we're looking at times, causes of death, and anything that's potentially preventable, what's published on that so far. We're then looking at gathering data from UK terrorist attacks, as well as supplementing that with some crime data from London HEMS patients, to really try to work out as close as possible times to death, which is something we don't have a lot of literature about, as well as causes and any interventions that might make a difference. But the time is the thing we really want to know about. And that's involving getting data and video footage from police, and the ambulance data and the air ambulance data, so and the pathology reports, and actually just getting data sharing agreements and trying to get the ethical approval and everything else for that joint project has been much harder, and actually I've had people, the various agencies saying, oh, if this is so hard, why is it so hard? It's never been done before, it's impossible. It's not impossible, but it's really important that we get to learn from all of those data together. And then another bit of it is qualitative review, which is questioning survivors and responders to terrorist attacks to pick up on things that have affected responders and their ability to respond, what they're willing to do, and equally from the survivors' point of view, what they'd expect from people responding. And actually that's being written up now, but there's some really fascinating information that I think, as people responding to these events, we don't ever really know what it's like to be on the other side of it. So learning from those people who have been involved and what it's like is really, really important. There's some really important things that have picked up that actually haven't changed, sadly, in the sort of many years since 7/7, and I think that we'll find there's a huge number of other research areas to work on from there. In particular, how we humanize some of the training for this, and that probably leads me into some of this triage stuff and how we really make it as practical as possible, but we try and bring in those human elements so people know what it's like to walk into a room like that and to have real people saying, don't stop on my son or my daughter, because actually we've kind of drilled it very much. They're not breathing the dead, it's a man, I can move on, they're not breathing the dead, and that's not what it's like for real. So we really want to bring that, some of what we've learned from the project, some of the real casualty timelines from the project, into future training, and hopefully to develop some of the death jobs and how we work together. And that's probably a point that's worth finishing with, actually, which is that at the moment, probably a lot of people know the MTA jobs say only ambulance for triage, and that was one of our stumbling blocks initially with this whole triage tool, was how could we get it agreed that everyone could do it. And there is a plan, I understand, that Jessup and the MTA jobs group have agreed to look to change that wording so that it says any emergency service can triage as long as they're using the recommended NHS England tool. So that was a big step that we got to, and does tie into a lot of the other work as well.
Listen, that's fantastic and an amazing place to finish. And I will just say this, just the something we notioned towards, and you mentioned earlier about this human factors piece, and actually bringing education to a place where it acknowledges the human factors involved and from a design phase, and actually what you're doing is building tools together with the team, building tools which actually complement the overwhelming human factors sometimes that a clinician can be going through, so that actually the tool complements the situation and facilitates the ability to win in that situation, to implement, to work in that situation, rather than maybe what we have now, or indeed for certainly historically, whereby reliant on long-term memory, reliant on on counting, on maths, on recollection, on clear lines of communication, so it's really, I'm a massive fan of this, because it really does, the work you're contributing towards both in hot zone working and in this helps people do their job better, which is a fantastic place to be, really. So thank you for this last hour, Claire. Thank you for your time, for your insights, and indeed for your work on this vital piece of work.
Thank you very much, Owen, and thank you for letting me talk about it for so long.
Listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.